originating from the podcast studio inside FAM 360's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. This is the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast. The Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast is designed to encourage, equip, and inspire our audience through a combination of inspirational stories and real-life experiences shared by other successful and skilled leaders in a variety of vocations. We hope that the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast empowers each one of us to step out, step up, and ultimately thrive as leaders. Now here's our host, Mr. Matt Maloney.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Matt Maloney. I am really excited today about today's guest. Before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to start with saying this. Like many in our audience, I'm in constant exploration and constant search of relevant information, tools, tactics, strategies, sound wisdom or knowledge that I believe will help refine me as a person to be the most effective, purpose-driven leader and overall really human being that I can be. A human being that produces fruit in their life, one that's equipped to share that fruit and ultimately lead an impactful life. For me, one of the most vital factors in living a fruitful life, particularly in my personal life, but also in my business life, is relationships and knowing how to manage relationships. And for me, relationships really being relational starts with two areas. One, the heart, and two, that's delivered, or being relational is delivered ultimately with other parties through communication, whether it's verbal or nonverbal communication. But here's the irony. As business leaders, many of us are really good at being relational. We're really good at communication, particularly in the workplace or in the community in which we serve. But we struggle to harness that sustained growth, that communication, that relational aspect in a consistent way, oftentimes in our personal life and more specifically in our marriages. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And that's why I'm super thankful for today's guest. And I'd like to introduce her. But I'm going to introduce her by sharing her bio, and then I'll reveal to the audience who she is. So she is a groundbreaking social researcher, best-selling author, and popular speaker. But above all else, she's a wife and a mother. She obtained her graduate degree from Harvard and spent many years working on Capitol Hill and Wall Street. Today, she applies her analytical skills to investigating eye-opening, life-changing truths about relationships, both at home and in the workplace. And through that journey, she's written several books for women only, The Kindness Challenge, and most recently, Thriving in Love and Money. She sold over 3 million copies of her books, and they're distributed in over 25 languages. So without further ado, allow me to introduce on the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast, Shaunti Feldhahn.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate
Welcome. So I thought we'd just kind of start off having you tell the audience a little bit just about your career background before we get into the book. Just, where you started your career. You worked on both Capitol Hill and Wall Street.
Yep.
Very different. Maybe in some cases there's similarities, and just share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I actually had no idea that I would be going down this road of social research and relationships and writing and speaking and all this. This was very unexpected. I got my graduate degree from Harvard and went and worked on Wall Street, basically analyzing large Japanese banks, analyzing the Chinese financial system.
Okay.
It was sort of an international SWAT team trying to keep track of what the heck was going on. And a lot of this was during the Asian financial crisis back in the 90s. And so it was very busy. I got about 2 years worth of experience for every one that I worked, because there were some long hours, as you can imagine.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't realize that I was building a skill set in analysis and research and trying to, dig out and investigate the little things that were mattering that you might have missed.
Yeah.
And then that I would be doing that for relationships a number of years later, because that's basically what I'm doing, is conducting research to try to dig out the little things that really matter for relationships.
It's the small things that are just covered up, or we don't even think that they're that important, and they are the difference makers.
High leverage stuff. Exactly.
So you were on Capitol Hill for a number of years as well?
I was. I actually worked on the Hill before I went to graduate school. And I was there. I was working for the Senate Banking Committee during the S&L and the savings and loan and banking crisis and all of that. And yet again, I got multiple years worth of experience for every one I worked because, again, long hours, intense, etc.
Yeah, and intense research, right? I mean,
exactly.
in that process. Yeah, I've had some experience in some of the committees and boards that I sit on and working with people on Capitol Hill, both our lobbyist firms and others, and it's a tough job.
It is crazy. It is one of those. This was my first job right out of college, so it was an incredible opportunity immediately after graduating from college. But yeah, those people are dedicated. And it's kind of one of my pet peeves when people get sort of snippy about public servants. It's like, no, really, like they really are. You may not agree with them, but they really are working very hard to try to help you, to try to help the country.
No doubt about it. And it probably is in many respects, a thankless job for many of them.
That's a great way of putting it.
Particularly the people behind the scenes that are doing a lot of the work. So you graduate, you go to graduate school at Harvard, you work on Wall Street.
Yep.
You're there for how long?
I was there for 4 years.
4 years?
Yep.
And then what propelled you to leave Wall Street and then eventually arrive at where you're at today?
So it's definitely one of those journeys that I couldn't have predicted. We basically, my husband and I had gotten married right out of graduate school, and he's an attorney, and he was working in one of those big sweatshop law firms in New York. Again, great experience, but you can only keep up that pace for so long.
Oh, sure.
And so we wanted to move. We moved to Atlanta so that he could take a job at a law firm here, and I had accepted a position to be the executive director of a nonprofit that was working with China, where I could essentially establish the headquarters anywhere I wanted. And so it was perfect. And we thought, excellent, we'll start our new life here in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And everything, we got started. 3 months later, after we had moved, after we had left, I loved my job on Wall Street. Like if it had just been me, I would have stayed there.
Stayed there, okay, yeah.
But obviously it wasn't just me, right? We're a pair.
Yeah.
And so it was fine, but after I'd left all my network, after I'd left and couldn't get my job back, 3 months after, I started here, I was called out to a board meeting and fired. And it was devastating. And it's sort of a long story. I was young enough to not realize I had set myself up for failure by accepting certain conditions of the job that I didn't have the skill set to really be successful at. And like, for example, fundraising. I didn't have a background in development. So it's one of those but I was too young to know that was just going to be a huge problem. Yeah. And they're like, she's raised no money. We got to get rid of her quickly.
Maybe they thought because you were on Wall Street, she's going to raise tons of money for us.
And it's like, just because you've been on Wall Street doesn't mean you have the connections or that skill set, right? And so it was a real, it was one of those moments where I had to come face to face with the fact that I was devastated beyond reason. And there was a lot of pride.
Sure.
There was a lot of prestige, having gone to Harvard and having worked on Wall Street. And I hadn't realized how much of that was in there, and how devastated I was sort of beyond all kind of, like I said, reason. It didn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so had to really wrestle with that. And now I look at what I'm doing now, which is very public, right? You could say very prestigious.
Yeah.
There's a lot of travel. There's a lot of attention. There's a lot of television. There's a lot of podcasts and radio.
Right, that's right.
And if I hadn't had sort of my head right-sized, it would have been pretty damaging to me. So that to me was actually a gift before all this got started.
Yeah. I think your head and your heart, right? I mean, you're
correct.
And thankfully I know faith is a big part of your life. And
it
so God takes us through those valleys, whether they're self-manifested valleys that really aren't as big as we think they are, right? Or not.
They look big to us.
They look huge to us, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I'd love to dive right into your most recent book, Thriving in Love and Money. And I think that I have a confession before we do.
Yeah.
This is a topic in this book that my wife and I avoid. And thankfully, misery loves company, because and
as you read, so did we.
That's right. Thankfully, you did too.
Yes.
So we're on opposite sides of the spectrum in certain things, and other things we're not. And sometimes she just doesn't even want to talk about money. She's like, it stresses me out. I don't want to think about that. You make the decision on that. And then of course, if I make a decision, she's like, why did you make that decision on that? I'm like, wait a minute.
Gosh, it sounds so familiar.
Oh my goodness. So by the time this episode actually airs, we will have likely gone through the whole book together. We're going through it now.
Oh, that's great.
So, but I do have a question. What was the motivation, because you've written books prior to this, but what was the motivation for you, and sharing with the audience? I think I know what it is, but behind this book, why did you decide to write this type of book?
To be candid, I'll just be honest about the fact that I never would have chosen this topic on my own, because it was an area that Jeff and I just avoided. Mm-hmm. And because after all of these years of research, of digging into relationships and like what matters, we had developed a pretty good marriage. We had applied a lot of the things we learned, but this area was one of the big areas where we were still not on the same page. And it was one of those crazy things that happened where we had been going, okay, should we do another research project? The business model has changed. How are we going to fund it? These are expensive. Mm-hmm. Like I knew this would be the next project would probably be about $120,000. I don't have that kind of change lying around. Yeah. And so we get this call out of the blue from a financial services company that's very missional. And they basically say, look, we have seen that this topic, money in marriage, is often a really big issue. We don't think it has to be. How would you feel about making this your next research project and us funding it?
Wow.
And we, of course, were like, oh my goodness. And then we were like, oh my goodness, because that means we're going to.
That's right.
That means we're going to have to talk about this. And so candidly, that's the reason we did it. It's like, I felt like God was just handing it to us and saying, okay, can't avoid this anymore. Here you go.
That's it. He's opening up this can right here. Get ready. Wow. Oh, that's great. Well, so you start off early in the book saying it's not about the money, right?
Yep.
If the money was the real issue, super wealthy people wouldn't have this issue and other things. And you talk about getting to the real issue. I mean, why don't we reveal to the audience, what is the real issue there?
So the big picture, by the way, and just so you know, the way that you put that it's not about the money, that's really honestly a summary of the whole book.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's a summary of what we found, is that it's not about the dollars and cents when you have tension or avoidance or whatever. It's about how money makes you feel. Mm. It's about all of the expectations that you have that are running under the surface that you don't even know are there. It's about all these insecurities and worries. Yeah. It's beliefs about how money should work from your childhood or all sorts of other places, your personality. It's about all these other things under the surface. And so the problem and the temptation is that we're dealing just up here. We're just dealing with the dollars and cents, and that's what we think is going on. And if that's what we're dealing with, we're never going to get at what's really going on. We're always going to be avoiding,
no doubt,
or whatever it is. It's interesting. I've done many financial radio programs now, and all of the hosts of these sort of financial call-in radio programs, they all say the same thing. They're like the top call that they always get when they open the lines is, how can I get my spouse on the same page? Like that's by far.
That's incredible.
That it's not, hey, what's the right, investment ratios for whatever. It's how can I get my spouse on the same page? And this is why. is there's all these factors. And so that's what the research was, is to identify what are those factors specifically.
That's great. And that in some ways, it doesn't shock me that is the number one question when they open up the air on that. But I guess it's one of those things where we just kind of push it. We keep pushing it to the side, or maybe kicking the can down the road, and we never really fully address it. Right. Yep. Which is your motivation behind this. So throughout the book, I love this. You have these little call out symbols, and where you have a call out and you're speaking, to, the way I interpret it, you're speaking to ladies about the men, right, and their point of view and their needs. And
in some of the chapters. Because some of them aren't gender related. But
correct,
yes,
that's right.
Some of them.
And then Jeff does the same thing, and those really caught my attention. And in particularly in chapter 4, Things That Go Bump in the Night, there's some overarching themes, fears, and needs in that chapter that I took out of it. Can you share just some key concepts from that chapter that can provide insight to maybe the opposite sex, right, about their spouse that are listening? Yeah,
absolutely. Before I jump into that, it's probably important for me to say these are generalizations. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we found in the research is that there's a lot of stereotypes about gender that didn't play out and these surveys are all I should also say, these surveys are all nationally representative across age and racial background and religious background, et cetera.
Of course.
And so we found, for example, one of the stereotypes that didn't play out is the idea that sort of men are the savers and women are the spenders. And no, it was actually about 50-50 for both sides.
Yeah.
But this one did catch our eye because statistically, men and women tend, not always, but tend to have two different sets of sort of primary fears that they're responding to when it comes to money and the broader context of money. And so in answer to your question, honestly, think of it like, and this is the analogy we use in the book, think of it like an irrational fear, like a fear of heights, right?
Sure.
Like I have a fear of heights, which is stupid. Like there's no reason. But if I am standing on the edge of like a really high bridge or a high cliff, I feel like it's going to pull me over.
Sure.
There's no reason for it, but it feels
has
like
that
that
changed
way.
over time? Because that's changed over time for me.
You are lucky. No, it hasn't at all, unfortunately. And so, and to me, it feels so obvious. Right? Like it's obvious you shouldn't stand on the edge of the cliff. Where for Jeff, he'll be like, hey, come here and take a selfie, on the edge. And I'm like, are you nuts? Like it's just obvious. That's just stupid. And it turns out that when it comes to money and kind of the broader context of how it works in our relationship, men and women tend to have two different sets of these kind of irrational cliff fears, so to speak. Where for guys, you can probably articulate it as basically, am I going to be able to provide for the family? Mm-hmm, like, are we going to be okay financially? Yeah. Like that cliff is pulling at me. It's there. Yeah. And it's always like you're getting pulled towards the edge. And so there's this desire, understandably, to back away from the edge and to try to do things that help you like not be afraid of that.
Yeah.
And so, for example, it's one of the reasons why we see men being more likely to, for example, I have to return every text from the boss. It doesn't matter if it's 1 o'clock in the morning because, if I don't, well, that could be 3 or 4 times away from being on some bad list somewhere. Right. And his wife goes, you're crazy. Like you were the top salesman last quarter. Like, why would you worry about this?
Why are you even thinking about that right now?
But to him, that cliff is there. And so he's backing away and he spends more time at the office or he tries to take all the extra deals or whatever it is that's his equivalent of that. And so he's pulling away. But what that does, it turns out, is trigger something on the wife's side because statistically, a woman's fear is not as likely to be, are we going to be financially okay? Although, as I said, women are just as concerned about money.
Sure.
But it's not this cliff fear, this irrational thing. For her, it's, are we okay? Like, is the family feeling loved? Are the kids happy? Like, is everybody engaged in the life of the family? And if, oh my goodness, if he is working all these hours, or if we're not attending to them, and, we're not going to their games, or whatever it is, then they're going to, grow up and leave us and never want to be home again.
Yeah.
Because they weren't feeling loved, or whatever that is. And so that cliff is there pulling at her.
Yeah.
And, maybe he's distant. And so she is thinking, oh my goodness, what's happening in our relationship? And what happened to this, attentive man that I married? And now he's stressed all the time. And oh my goodness. So what she does.
Have you been talking to my wife? Have you been talking to my
No, I've just been talking to a lot of people over the years. You guys are just one of the 40,000 men and women we've surveyed over the years. And so her version of backing away from the cliff, her version of putting some distance is, okay, we have to do something to sort of advance togetherness. We have to do something to create connection. So literally in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic, I was in a grocery store, and I tend to strike up conversations with random people because you get good data, because they don't, you don't know who they are. They can be honest. And it was the wife of a police officer. They had a young son who I'm guessing, based on what she said, was probably like 8 or 9 years old. And the wife of this police officer, if you remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was all the social unrest. So police officers were working a zillion hours. And so she was like, we haven't seen him. And little Johnny, whatever their son's name, is missing his dad. So we say, honey, why don't we, come down to the cafe near the station for dinner 2 or 3 times a week?
Yeah.
Okay. Because that's a way to at least get some together time. Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, what does that do? That's spending money to try to advance togetherness. And that pulls him towards his cliff. Yeah. So he tries to back away more, and there's more distance. And so she is now pulled towards her cliff. So she tries to do things. And you can see how these things that we do to try to combat our fears, they tend to trigger the other person's.
Yeah. You're right.
And that's not always the case, but it's a really, really common dynamic.
That's incredible. I think that, and I was being serious. I'm like, did you talk to my wife? Because we have these, not verbatim, but close, these same conversations in different, slightly different contexts, but similar. And she's constantly worried about I'm running this organization. We have all these operating companies under it. I've worked long hours. Even in the pandemic exacerbated it because there was no division. There were no boundaries when I was at home. I was at home and I was just working. So next thing you know, I'm working. It's 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. I did break for dinner, but I went back to work. And she says, you're not spending any time in the family. And
if I can put words in your mouth, which may not have been you, but I heard from many people, and this wasn't just men, right? There's women who feel this way as well, but statistically more common among men, where they're like, and it's a pandemic. And if I don't put my, every effort into it, I don't know what's going to work, not going to work. I don't know if we're going to be homeless in 20 years, when we retire. Yeah. And so that's really the issue, is that is a very real fear for many, many men, that many women are like, look, that's an issue, but wow, it's a much bigger thing to be worried about this precious time that we have as a family. Yep. And many men are like, but we're fine as a family. Like, why are you worried about me being distant? It's fine. It's fine. Like, I love you. We're cool.
But that's her fear.
Right.
And it's fear. And I talk about this a lot with my wife, that, my fear is, I'm fearful that, I'm not going to tend to my business enough and things are going to fall apart. If I leave too long, they're going to fall apart, right? Yep. If I don't do X, Y, and Z, we could put ourselves in financial struggle or her fears are totally different. So it's the fear is that element, that vehicle that's driving both of these things.
Her fears are what you just said about your business, but for the family and the marriage.
For the family and the marriage. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like if you leave it too long, it's going to fall apart. If you don't attend to it, things will go downhill.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's exactly the same. It's just a different one. And honestly, the thing I want to probably mention that's pretty crucial here, one of the biggest problems is that we're not viewing the other person's fear as real. Right? Like
we're just discounting it.
We're discounting it. Like, honey, of course we're fine. Well, you know, no, that's like a real concern for her. The same way that it is for you when she would say, you know, honey, just let it go for a couple weeks. Like it can run on its own. You've got people operating these businesses. They're fine. No, like it feels very real that you can't. Yeah.
That's great. So, I think in some ways you may have touched on this, but I'd like to bring it back. So what is the number one fact couples need to know if they want to decrease the tension around money issues in their marriage inside the house? What's that number one fact that they really need to know? Well,
the main thing is keep in mind constantly when you're having that tension, it's not about that money stuff, right? It's not the money itself. It's all this stuff underneath it. And so there's a very real need when you're in the middle of it to stop and go, wait, you know, let me just think about, it's not about what I think it is, what's going on under the surface. Because if you address that, then suddenly things start working. And then probably the number one tactical thing that people need to know how to do in order to do that is people have to be able to talk about money. And just recognizing, again, you're not talking about the money, you're talking about that underground stuff.
Yeah. So is that aha moment really realizing that, hey, it's this fear that's driving each one of us. Our fear, those things are different, right? But it's really, that's the underpinning of it. It's the fear. Now we need to be able to be sensitive and have communication and talk about and peel the onion back on those fears. Is that kind of an aha moment? And
to honor the other person and to recognize again that it's legitimate and to sort of not discount that this is going to be under the surface of them, whether you think it is or not, or whether you think it should be or not.
Yep.
So again, for example, if the wife of that police officer, let's just use a case study, right? If she would have said to him, oh, you know, I'm sure he was acting out of, okay, I'm going to get every overtime hour I possibly can, right? Like this is an opportunity. If she would have basically told him that's stupid, you know, no, just work a normal schedule. And then there's all these other things, like he's letting his troop down, and there's all these, you know, they're having to
have a responsibility to them. I'm not going to let them down.
And that's the case in business. It's the case in everything. Yep. And if she would have discounted that, he might have, for her sake, if she would have insisted, okay, I'll work a normal schedule. But there would have been, first of all, there's still the fear there, which she's not noticing. But then there could have been resentment. Then there could have been all these things that come up in his heart that she doesn't want. She just didn't even realize they were there, right? And the same thing on his side. Like if he's discounting that she's feeling like, you haven't seen our son in like a week and a half for more than a minute here and there because he's in bed, you know, by the time you get home. If he discounts that, then it's the same thing. Like, it could cause resentment. It could cause a, you know, marriage issue that doesn't have to be there.
Yeah. My wife talks about quality time. Like, yes, you're present, you're here, but is this really quality time that you're spending with the, you know, and so that's where her fear is. Before we wrap up, I'd like to close out with this quote from you, actually. When we have conflict around money, it's not about the money. It's about how money makes us feel. And it's an opportunity for either conflict or connection. Shaunti, thanks for joining us again today. It was both inspirational and empowering to me, and I hope it was for our audience.
Thanks.
And we can't wait to have you on the next episode.
I am looking forward to it.
To all of our listeners and subscribers out in podcast land, I hope today's episode was both empowering and inspirational. Until the next episode, I hope and pray that our daily lives are filled with opportunity to lift others up as we aim to go above and beyond. Thanks, everybody.
Our executive producer and host is Matt Maloney, President and CEO of FAM360. Strategic Communication Coordinator, Michelle Ducato. Production assistance by Tin Dog Studios. Director, John Berland. Creative Assistant, Whitney Berland. Theme song, Connecting Dots by Curtis Cole, provided by Artlist. Please subscribe today and don't miss any of our weekly episodes.